Hi, welcome. Welcome to the IG Live. Second.
Thank you.
Um, so thank you. I'm so excited that you're joining. For those of you listening in, joining us to talk about Apple, Sarah Gardner is, I don't know, like my hero. And I've been admiring her from afar for many, many years as she's been a part of the leadership of Thorn, of course, one of the leading child online safety organizations. Sarah's been in this movement for many, many years, and I am super excited that she is now leading the HEAT initiative, which she will tell you more about. And I'm particularly excited because, there's not that many organizations in this space that are really pressing in a very public way on big tech, these major corporations, and holding them accountable. And HEAT initiative really is zeroing in on one of the biggest, literally has more resources and power and influence than many nations, and that is Apple. So I'll introduce myself to you. I'm Lynn Nealon. I am the director of corporate advocacy at the National Center on Sexual Exploitation, also a vice president here. And we are talking about Apple being on the Dirty Dozen list. Now, Apple was on last year. Apple App Store was on last year for deceptive practices. But this year, we decided to put all of Apple on the Dirty Dozen list. And in large part, it was due to Sarah and HEAT Initiative's efforts. We really wanted to very publicly stand in support of their work, join the call in holding Apple accountable for not detecting child sex abuse material on iCloud. So before I launch in, I think this is going to be part one of 2 IG Lives about Apple because there's just so much to talk about. Big tech titan. But really, Sarah, given your work and just how critical it is, I really want to help our audience understand, first of all, how big the problem is, right? Of child sex abuse material, in particular on Apple, and how do companies detect child sex abuse material? We often hear the concerns, does it invade privacy? People, I think everybody wants to protect kids, but then there's all these questions around privacy. So first, let's start. I just want you to share HEAT's origin story because it's so fantastic.
Oh my gosh. Well, that was such a kind introduction. Thank you so much. Very generous. And I guess actually the place I want to start is in saying back to you and the NCOSE audience, this action that we're taking now against Apple has been inspired by the work of others who came before us and continue to do the work as well. So your organization is one of the few that is willing to call out specific companies and lay out specific demands about where they're failing children. And so honestly, it was in part seeing your work and the work of other corporate campaigners in other spaces that inspired me and my team to think about what is the power behind calling out a specific company with specific demands? What does that do, or what function within our field or our movement does that play? And that plays into the origin story as well. So very briefly, as you mentioned, I was with Thorn for over 10 years. And that was my education of how these technologies actually work, that companies can use to do this work, how those decisions are made, the investment they make in prioritizing children's safety or not, right? That was where I really gained that knowledge. And as a complete surprise, in many ways, in August 2021, Apple came out of nowhere. I remember it was like August 3rd or August 4th, because I was on vacation and I got a call, like Apple's gonna make this big announcement tomorrow. And of course, we were in shock in many ways because Apple had been notoriously absent from convenings and conversations amongst tech companies about how to do this work for the decade that I had worked in the field. And so for them to then announce that they had built this solution to detect known child sexual abuse material, Unfortunately, their announcement included a lot of different features, and that was part of the problem, is it confused people. We can talk about that more if you want. But when they said they were going to do this, it was absolutely groundbreaking in terms of a company that had basically, for all intents and purposes, been ignoring the problem altogether to come out and say they're going to do it. And just the real quick version of what inspired me, or it's honestly like what called me to leave and go work on this, is when they changed their mind. So I'll never forget the day that they announced they were pausing and they weren't moving forward with it, and nothing happened.
To clarify, they had announced that they were going to detect child sex abuse material on the iCloud, right?
Yes.
And then they got a lot of pushback from some other groups. I'll call them privacy absolutists. And then they rolled back the decision, right? Like they paused it. Right.
Yes. Yes. And nothing happened when that happened, in the sense of there was no, I mean, we all tried, like we wrote emails, we called into our contacts at Apple and we're like, wait, what is happening? You can't just abandon this issue altogether after especially after you've named it as a priority, or you've put intention behind why it's important to do, right? And that was in a lot of their communication. So between August and like middle of September, when you paused it, did you decide that this was no longer important, that removing abuse videos of a 4-year-old was no longer important? Like what changed? And just to finish off that story, so what concerned me was that it was very clear that Apple was not afraid of our movement or fallout from that decision. And so that demonstrated that we don't have enough power yet to make them really listen and weigh what are the pros and cons of these decisions. And later that year, I was at a conference and I spoke with someone from Apple, and I said to that person, people are going to come after you guys for making this commitment and then just not doing anything. And this person was like, no, they're not. Nobody's coming after us. Nobody's bothered. Nobody's saying anything. And that literally was the moment where I was like, I'm leaving my job to go do this. And that was also a really hard decision, because I loved my job and I loved the work we were doing. But so it's not so much about, I mean, it is about heat and what we're working on and all of that. But actually what it's more about is trying to figure out how we as a field and a movement now create that pressure and that fire, so that when the companies are making these decisions, and unfortunately they're making them from an extremely sort of non-emotional, like the moral argument won't win necessarily. It will be brass tacks business decisions. What is going to cost them more?
Right.
To make a bad decision about child safety and have all of us advocates come after them, or to sort of hold up this false choice that you have to choose between one or the other, user privacy or child safety, which is a false choice.
Right. I love that term, false choice. And I remember Frances Haugen, the whistleblower from Meta, using that a lot too, and saying big tech is so good at that, presenting these false choices to us, that you can't have child online safety and privacy. So, okay. So glad Heat is putting pressure on, because you're right. We need, there needs to be that business fallout for sure. And I feel like more and more I'm hearing frustrations about Apple, not only not detecting CSAM, but also just in general, how hard they make it for even parents to protect their kids on the iPhones and etc. But talk to me more about the false choice and break it down for me. How can companies, how do companies currently detect child sex abuse material, and where does that come into play with user privacy, which I want, right? Like I don't want companies in this. Break it down for us a little bit.
Yeah, no, it's a great question. So there's a lot of ways to approach it. I think what I'd want to start with is child sexual abuse material is illegal content. That actually provides companies with a lot of kind of security and opportunity to detect it report and remove it, because they're actually just enforcing their own terms of service. So if you look at any of these companies, they will say in their terms of service, you cannot store or share child sexual abuse content. So just even that fundamental truth makes it very clear that Apple could be doing this at scale, and they're actually only enforcing their own principles or their own terms of service. The next thing I would add on and layer to that is there's been a conflation between user privacy and user data and the allowing for illegal child sexual abuse material to proliferate on these platforms and the downsides of that, right? So, oh, the kid's already been identified and recovered. Like, is it really that bad then for their video to continue to be passed around? So I want to get to that next, but going back to that conflation, when you poll Americans, what most Americans want is kind of what you were saying, which is they don't want their data bought and sold and monetized without their consent. They don't want to get hacked. They don't want their personal information, hacked out of their accounts and put out on the internet, right?
Right.
They didn't agree to creating wholly private environments where young children can talk to random strange adults, which we do not allow for in real life.
Right.
And they also didn't agree that people should be able to possess this illegal child sexual abuse content and just share it and trade it with impunity. So what's benefited sometimes, like the privacy hardliners narrative, is this idea of, well, you can't have that first thing I described if you want to do the second. And that is also, and that's where it's just fundamentally untrue. And who it comes down to is the company. So the advocates will say, well, then the companies will be forced to look for XYZ and all this other stuff, and all of a sudden you could become a victim of theirs because someone doesn't like you, and they'll be forced to look for it and report about you. They control their own environment. We cannot, other than when you have a subpoena, which means there's evidence from law enforcement, no one can force them to look for anything else except child sexual abuse. So another way that argument has benefited them is it absolves them of the decision making and the principles that they would have to hold, which is to say, we're going to look for child sexual abuse and nothing else. And that was really the solution that they introduced, was they said, we're going to look for child sexual abuse and nothing else. So the last thing I would just say is, they're doing this, they're filtering for things like spam, for malware on your phone. So sometimes the technical arguments for why they can't do something are also very blurry, because they're doing it for certain things, but not for this.
Right.
And that's also just a frustrating reality.
Wow. Can you talk about just also, I know there was a report in Europe, it was across 8 countries, that ACPAT International did, which is also a child safety organization. And they were really surprised to find that many people didn't even realize that there was technology. The hashing technology was fingerprint that you can put on known child sex abuse imagery, and many people didn't even realize that. Have you found, and what the report then showed was that the vast majority of people were willing to, with protecting their data, were willing to give up a level of privacy in order to identify this child sex abuse material. Do we know, like, Americans' points on this? Like, I believe you guys have done a similar study. What did you find?
Oh my gosh, I think it was like upwards of 86%, maybe even closer to 90. We can get the exact number of Americans, when forced to choose, would choose giving up personal privacy in order to protect children on platforms. Absolutely. Wow. And a lot of them, honestly, a lot of Americans already think it's happening. Right. That's actually been kind of an interesting challenge in some ways with some of this work, right? It's so obvious that, like, how is it not already happening? And so we have to get over the hump of, like, really? Are you sure? Have you asked them? And we're like, yeah, we're sure. So that the results from that study that you just described in Europe very much mirrored what we found in the US polling Americans. And I also think there's just something about like community or social agreements, which is that adults understand, reasonable adults, that if we are sharing spaces with children, then we have to make them safe for children as well. Again, the parallels to the real world, right? And so I think that it's just explaining it in that way that helps people understand this isn't about like finding dirty secrets on me and like exposing them. And the hash matching technology, I did want to mention that Thorn has a really great video. We can send the link after this live to a video they made explaining hash matching. And I do think that that also really helps people understand it's a fingerprint of a known child sexual abuse video. And shout out to the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children, NCMEC, because they actually just put out a report on like basically how verified that hash set is. Like
9.9%, right?
Yes.
They have a third, yeah.
Right. And so I think, you know, there's a little bit of a discourse of like, well, what if they get it wrong? And it's like, that's why there are all these review processes in place.
Right.
That's why it goes to the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children. What I would love to see is a world where we are more upset about the kid we missed.
Yeah.
And that you get held accountable for like missing a kid or you missed abuse.
Right.
Why are we flipped?
Right. Right. On that too, can you just, you know, I think like even before I started working at NCOSE, I would have thought, you know, child sex abuse material, you know, what we used to call child pornography, like that's not going to happen to my kid. Like, of course I was upset about it, but you know, it's maybe it doesn't seem as real. Or again, we've even heard like from tech companies that some within their, you know, their colleagues will say, well, you know, it's a small percentage, or they kind of justify it, or like the abuse already happened. And like now that out there, there's not much we can do. Can you talk a little bit to like how big of a problem is this?
Yeah.
And to that point of, okay, well, like it's out there, right?
Yeah.
Like the real abuse has already happened.
Yeah. Oh man, this is a really important topic. Okay, so I think first to the re-victimization piece, the Canadian Center for Child Protection has some incredible research studies that they've done with survivors of child sexual abuse material about the ongoing mental health implications of knowing that your content is out there, that others are, you know, viewing it nowadays, that it adds to the feeling that you cannot escape it and you cannot move on. And it has very real implications for how these individuals can live their lives freely or not, honestly. But I think the bigger effect of it being easily shared and traded on the internet is the ease at which then people can share it and spread this content, which a former colleague of mine used to refer to as malware of the mind.
Wow.
So what are all the other negative effects of it being out there? So we know child sexual abuse material is used to groom other kids. So this, to your point about your kid, right? So your kid may not be a victim of abuse at the hands of an adult that is like photographed or videotaped and put on the internet, right? But what they may be a victim of is an adult who's creepy on Instagram, who is targeting your kid, strikes up a conversation with them, and then uses CSAM to say, hey, like, look at this. Like, what do you think about this? And they ask them questions about it, and they start to normalize it, and then they send them a little bit more. That has obviously two major negative effects. One is now a child's being groomed with it. And then again, those survivors know that perpetrators are using their content to groom other children. That's horrific. So and then like the third piece, if you really want to also think about prevention, and I think about this a lot. I have two sons who are 8 and 6. Like, I just don't want them coming across this stuff easily. Like, it messes with the young brain's mind. Another report just came out yesterday on this. I haven't had a chance to read it yet, I'm really looking forward to this data, which is like, what does it do to kids and families when kids accidentally view or consume child sexual abuse content when they're like 12, 13 years old?
Right.
They don't want to see
But
it.
consuming pornography has such detrimental effects, but right, that they're viewing other children, like
Yes.
kids their age. Right.
Yes. And so we have a duty to make it basically impossible for children to come across child sexual abuse material. That feels like, as a society, that just feels like pretty basic.
Right.
And so those are some of the arguments I would use back towards those tech companies.
Right.
And I understand, they're like thinking, well, this one thing is traded so much. And, my question is like, well, what's the harm of just taking it down anyway? It's a meme, it's not as bad or whatever. It's still child sexual abuse content. Why are you
Legal.
allowing it?
Right.
Yeah, right.
It's illegal if for no other reason. I would just think, even from like the liability perspective,
Yeah,
which again, that's a whole other panel discussion. But no, you raised so many good points. We hear the same thing from survivors. Like, when it is out online, it is like they are being abused over and over
yeah,
again. Um, and I think too, it's so important for people to understand that child sex abuse material, and this is not to like put the blame on teens or even preteens or children, that we know that sharing their own sexually explicit content, right, their own self-generated child sex abuse material, is rapidly on the rise.
yeah,
And I mean, predators are saying, like, this is a gift to predators who can, again, like you said, use this content to groom other children. They post this content elsewhere to gain access into other pedophile networks.
yeah,
Again, it's harmful and so risky to kids. We're hearing these FBI warnings over and over again. We were just
yeah.
seminar around sexual extortion,
I know.
and it's kids sending their own images to these extortionists, who then use that to blackmail them. And tragically, even children have taken their own lives because of it. It's so
So
rapid,
sad.
and manipulate them
Yeah,
so well. And when you think about, I mean, Sarah, 87% of US teens own an iPhone, right? So do the math.
yeah,
The exploitation and use is very likely happening, even through the apps accessed by the iPhones, right?
yes,
And through messaging. So my other point, the question. So when decided to no longer, they made this announcement, they are not going to detect for CSAM on iCloud. They said, okay, well, instead, how we're protecting children is we're investing in this communication safety feature.
yeah,
Um, can you share a little bit about that, and whether or not you think that's adequate, and if not, what more could they be doing? Again, they're like, we're not
yeah,
scanning CSAM. So like, oh, for me, I was like, okay, you guys better be doing everything you can to prevent exploitation through your products and
yeah,
on your tool. So talk to us about communication safety. Do you think it's enough? And what more should they be doing?
yeah. Great question. They're wildly distinct solutions for different problems, right? So the communication safety feature, I talk about it as like the baseline, the absolute baseline that would need to be in place to say you are running a safe messaging tool for kids. And like you just said, 80% of American teenagers have iPhones. So that's your audience, that's your group, right? So what Apple has ducked out of for a long time is that they're not social media. So people can't find the kids as easily. People can't, we talked about grooming and all this. That may be true. However, those abusers oftentimes move to chat and iMessage with these teenagers because they know it is a safe space for
Right.
them to do their thing,
Right.
right? So kids are communicating through iMessage.
Mm-hmm.
The way the communication safety feature works, or the output of that, is it is literally a road, like a stop sign or a speed bump. So a kid's in the moment, they're getting sent things, and maybe this is like with a consensual partner, right? But to your point, you never know how those relationships go, and then someone feels wronged and they're sharing the image at their school, right? So you want to create that pause for the kid in the moment of like, is this something I really want to do? And have those conversations replaying in their head they've heard hopefully at school or from their parents or from others, which is like any photo, any video that you take, that you share could end up on the internet forever, right? So it is a step. It's better than nothing, absolutely. But Apple doesn't also offer kids in iMessage a reporting function,
Right.
an easy reporting tool to alert Apple to abuse that's happening with them in iMessage. And I would say that is because Apple does not want
They
to
don't
know.
want to know.
And they don't want to be
Exactly.
the ones that are supposed to deal with that. They want,
Right.
now so that is one of our other demands, is that they provide easy user reporting for their users out of iMessage. And yes, you can go dig around on their website and find an email, and then you can email, but it's like, what kid is going to take all those steps?
No.
And there are other fully encrypted messaging platforms like WhatsApp who refuse to do detection of the image actually in the pipe, but do allow for users to report child sexual abuse material. And they had, at least the year before last, upwards of 1.2 million reports just from detecting the profile photos of groups and people reporting. So you can imagine like what iMessage's numbers would look like if they actually offered that function.
Infuriating, because it's like literally this is industry standard, right? Again, bare basics, and it could literally save
100%.
a child, right? Like if the child's report, and we know that children, Thorne's research, children are much more likely to just report in in the app on the device rather than go to a parent or a trusted adult. So these literally are leaving kids, at potential harm's way. I have to note, communication safety, we had to fight tooth and nail for Apple to default that for 12 and under. And it's not even defaulted for teenagers. So like teens need to go in and turn on this communication safety feature in order to blur, not block, only blur sexually explicit imagery that they can click again with the button. So, and again, this is like, it's illegal, right? If Apple is able to detect that it's very likely sexually explicit content, why are you putting the burden on kids to make the choice of whether or not to view it, right? And I argue, like you were saying, like, let's err on the side of safety. Then if it's a false, if it's actually not sexually explicit imagery, then the sender can appeal that rather than just letting the child view it, right? Like, and instead of having to, like, the moderators have to view the sexually explicit content. I can't believe we're at time already. I feel like we could talk for hours, but the whole purpose of the Jury Doesn't List campaign and Heat's initiative is to get people to take action. We're pressing on the corporations themselves, we're meeting with them, but really getting people like up in arms and putting heat on these companies. We as users, we as customers, as investors, as shareholders want you to do better. So what are your parting words if the people listening to this live, whether now or later, what do you want them to do? And what do you hope for Apple to do, let's say, by the end of this year?
These are such great questions. And that speech like riled me up, Lena. This is why we have so much fun together. Like I'm like supercharged now. Okay, I would say these would be my asks of anyone listening. One is I would ask that you tell one person about this conversation. It's a hard conversation to have. All of us just getting more used to talking about it, normalizing it, and in particular for this fight, normalizing us going after a company like Apple has been really, really hard because people really like Apple, right? And they're like, I don't know, like Meta's bad and X is bad, but Apple's good. Let's get rid of that language. Let's just focus on where there is negligence and where they need to make changes. So mentioning it to one person is helpful because it validates what we're so upset about in this conversation, and makes it more of a mainstream conversation. The second thing I'd ask people to do is to go to heatinitiative.org. Yes, it has a lot of I's. You have to type very slowly. Initiative and .org. And on there, you can email Apple leadership. So we have this really cool function on our website where it's going to their actual inboxes and it doesn't get spammed out because of the way the brilliant team set it up. And so 20 people on the Apple leadership team will get that email saying, I want these, I want these changes. I think we've had 17,000 emails go to Apple leadership.
Wow.
So they can't say nobody's
Right.
contacting us, blah, blah, blah. And then the third thing I, would say is just keep a lookout for when Heat and other activists are out there marching around, bringing the fight to the front door of Apple and other places. And the more you can share that moment or that content that comes out of those pressure moments, pressure points, that's super helpful as well.
Love it. All right. Very concrete actions. We will be sure to put heatinitiative.org everywhere. You can also go dirtydozenlist.com, click on Apple. You'll see Heat's petition there, as well as ours. It takes less than 30 seconds, people, truly. So
Awesome.
please do something. It works. Have a track record of companies making changes, but we truly, really need the public to voice their concerns, because that's who they care about, right? The user and the potential buyer. So let's keep the heat on Apple. I believe they will change. Knowing you, Sarah, you're gonna make it happen. So come on, people, join us in the fight. And this, you can make change happen. So
thank you,
Sarah, for everything that you're doing, for fighting for all the kids. And to our listeners, thanks for joining us. Go share this with one other person and visit heatinitiative.org. And we will see you next week to hear about Microsoft's GitHub, Wednesday at noon Eastern time. Microsoft's GitHub literally probably has the single greatest ability to really stem the deep fake abuses that we're seeing, the sexual abuses that are now really proliferating very rapidly, being weaponized against women and girls. So you'll learn more about that next week. Thanks, Sarah.
Thank you so much. You all are awesome. Appreciate the opportunity. Thank you.
It was a pleasure.
Okay.
Bye.
Bye.